Hello. My name is Julia Barquillo, and I would like to speak to you today about the death of my sister, Maura Clark, the reaction of our government to this, and why it is important for you today. Maura's background might not be that different from yours. She came from New York. Maura made the decision to enter Marino while she was in college because she wanted to serve God and the poor. Her first assignment was at St. Anthony of Padua in the South Bronx. Then she went on mission, where she spent 17 years in Nicaragua. She was in Ciuna, where she was responsible for bringing water to a rural area, and in Managua during the earthquake of 1972. She returned home in 1977 and there spent 3 years with the Marino Peace and Justice team. She worked up and down the eastern seaboard. She wanted to return to Nicaragua in 1980, but because of the massive killing by security forces and the death of Oscar Romero in '79, she decided to go to Chalatenango to be with Eva Ford. There, the two of them were distributing food that was donated by CARE. They were giving the food to the women and children who were left without means of support because of the massive killings of the security forces. On December 2nd, Maura and Ida were returning from a regional conference in Managua. They were met by Sister Dorothy Kazel, a nursing sister from Cleveland, Ohio, and Jean Donovan, a lay missionary, who was beautifully presented here today. Their van was intersected in a dark part of the road by a roadblock. Their car was taken by 4 plainclothes Salvadoran soldiers. They were brought to a dark, lonely place. There, they were tortured, raped, and murdered. On December 3rd, their bodies were found by a farmer. The farmer reported this to the local, he reported it to the local military. The military told him to bury the bodies. Fortunately, he also reported this to the parish priest. The priest contacted the United States government, which was Robert White. Robert White sorry here. Robert White was heard to say to reporters, "They won't get away with it this time." On December 4th, the bodies were exhumed, and the minivan was found and burned out. In the United States, there was an outcry for justice for the people. They commenced an investigation which quickly turned into a whitewash. The State Department ordered Ambassador White to report progress into the investigation. He said he could not report any progress because there was no progress in the case, and refused to participate in the cover-up. He was relieved of his post and his days were numbered. His political career thus ended. Meanwhile, back in the States, Ronald Reagan assumed office and appointed Alexander Haig to be Secretary of State. Haig expressed the attitude of the United States government in his testimony before the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives. He said, and I'm going to quote this exactly, "I would like to propose that some of the investigation would lead one to believe that perhaps the vehicle the nuns were driving in had tried to run a roadblock, or may have accidentally been perceived to have been doing so, and there may have been an exchange of gunfire." This self-evident fabrication galvanized for Eda's brother, Bill Ford, who was a prominent litigation attorney in Manhattan, to devote the remaining 30 years of his life to determine the truth and to find justice for the dead women. He and I and others spent years traveling to Washington, meeting with State Department officials, senators and representatives trying to determine the truth. Progress was uneven. Officials such as Thomas Anders and Elliot Abrams offered us coffee and assured us that they would uncover the truth, but they did not. Meanwhile, the Reagan administration increased military aid to El Salvador, while the death squads continued their murderous rampage. Over time, and because of pressure from church groups, the public, and politicians such as Tip O'Neill, Ted Kennedy, and John Kerry, the numerous others, the decade-long war ground to a halt. In 1984, 4 low-level enlisted men were tried and convicted of the crime. They spent a few years in prison. In 2000, Bill, the families, and Mike Posner of Human Rights First brought a civil suit in federal court in West Palm Beach against General Luis Casanova and General Guillermo Garcia. Incredibly, unknown to the public, both had been living in the United States. They were brought here by our government. They denied any involvement in the murder, and despite overwhelming evidence against them and the testimony of Robert White and others, they were exonerated. My generation did not question our government's policies or statements. It was inconceivable that they would either lie to us or shade the truth. El Salvador changed that attitude. Even though it is still difficult to question a government's policy when it holds all the information, its citizens must. There is a vast difference between a cynic and a responsible citizen. It is your duty to have an open mind and ask responsible questions of your government. It is the duty of the government to respond truthfully.
Laura, Ida, Dorothy, and Jean chose to accompany a people made profoundly vulnerable by war and by repression. They lived the virtue of solidarity. Poor people, they believed, were one place of God's revelation in history, an opening where the God of hope and possibility was discovered in the midst of suffering and fear. A place where the gospel story was presented in living color. Martyrdom comes from life, not from death. These four women simply agreed to locate themselves in places where they would encounter life, with poor people on the margins of society. Mara and her friends said yes to an invitation they clearly heard through a dialogue of the heart with people deliberately displaced from their homes and their villages. They saw the brutality of a government at war with its own people, and they stayed to bear witness to life. When they were killed, as Julia said, they put a familiar human face on the thousands of Salvadoran lay people, religious, and priests who had already, by late 1980, been martyred. In fact, across Latin America in those years, hundreds of thousands of poor people and those who walked with them, literally or in spirit, were tortured and disappeared. But the U.S. Churchwomen's deaths provided a lens through which the U.S. public could better understand what was happening so close to our southern border. They gave enormous energy to a social movement that was, in those years, trying to understand what it meant to live the virtue of solidarity, to accompany people in another corner of the world who were threatened on a daily basis and brutally killed for daring to live the gospel. These are times very different from the era of the martyrs in El Salvador, in Latin America. These are times defined by excessive wealth concentrated in the hands of a small minority in almost every country in the world, and by intransigent poverty lived by a global majority. These are times defined by increasingly evident ecological catastrophe and by a growing awareness of the intrinsic interconnectedness of humans with each other and with the rest of creation. The experience of solidarity between U.S. people and the people of Central America in the 1970s and 80s and 90s taught us about interdependence and about security rooted in transnational community. That rich and deep experience of solidarity exposed the lie that the security of a wealthy and powerful few is somehow threatened by the majority's desire for and right to a dignified, decent life. Unless the grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. The last words of Archbishop Oscar Romero were about the price of liberation, the cost of solidarity, but also about life and hope. Let me share with you just briefly a little story. In 1986, with about 20 other internationals, I accompanied a group of 500 displaced Salvadorans back to their own land, which at that time was still in the middle of a very conflicted area. Many of them had been living at a refugee camp in San Salvador for 6 or 7 or 8 years, and they were simply bone tired of being unable to plant crops or to care for their families. So they decided to go home. After a few very difficult days, we were arrested, the 20 internationals accompanying the Salvadoran community. We were forced by the Salvadoran military to leave the returning families a few very heavily mined kilometers from their ultimate destination, their cooperative. We and they were not sure, as they carted us away, whether they would survive, because they had known of the massacres in community after community across El Salvador. But they did. They planted their crops, and when they reached their first harvest, beans and corn a few months later, they sent each one of us a little packet of black beans and corn kernels. I've treasured those seeds ever since as a powerful symbol of courage and life and of solidarity. I lost my first cousin in the World Trade Center. About a week after the attack, I found my way down near Ground Zero to the site of the devastation and planted a few of those seeds from El Salvador in a small park as close as I could get to the destruction. In some ways, it was a pretty futile gesture, indicative, I think, of my inability to imagine any other way to express my sorrow to my cousin's wife and his two young children. On the other hand, I believed that those seeds carried great weight. The weight of what might blossom if we were to open our hearts as a nation to a way of life given to global solidarity. Over a year later, I returned to Ground Zero, to that little park where I had planted the seeds, just to see the area after the debris had been cleared and to remember those who died there. And there in that little park was a tall stalk of corn where I had planted that seed. It was really unbelievable, but it was such a powerful sign of hope to me. The seeds of solidarity that had nourished us, North Americans and Central Americans together, will bear rich fruit personally, nationally, and globally if we are willing to risk planting them again. Maura, Ida, Dorothy, and Jean went to El Salvador to live, not to die. But their determination to accompany people displaced, brutalized, stalked by death and war made them a presence too dangerous and too threatening for those in power to ignore. In the days immediately following their killings, high-level U.S. authorities, in addition to suggesting that they had tried to run a roadblock, as Julia said, also accused them of being gun runners and sympathizers with rebel groups in El Salvador. But in reality, they were doing exactly what we who would follow Christ are also called to do. In Maura's words, to accompany those who suffer the most and to give witness to our hope in the resurrection. I would guess that if Maura, Ida, Dorothy, and Jean were here this morning, they might say two things to you. First, go see for yourself. Go to the other side of the world, the other side of the border, the other side of town, the other side of the tracks. Open your heart and mind to the reality of life lived at the margins and under threat. Make that reality three-dimensional. Give it a human face, a name, a history. Don't play it safe. You will see the gospel there in living color, we promise. And second, make the fundamental option of your own life, peace, social justice, and right relationships with all people and all of creation. Shape your career, your life's work to make a difference. Make your lifestyle, your priorities, how you spend your time, how you love and live out your relationships, how you earn a living, what you eat, how you use natural resources, what you wear, how you parent when the time comes, how you care for the earth, consistent with that fundamental option. Don't let passion for peace and justice be a phase in your life. Let it be the cornerstone of your life. Maura, Ita, Dorothy, and Jean, presente. Thank you.